Hi, everyone. Welcome to my podcast. This is Professor Jie. Today, I'm very happy to have my good friend, Dr. Mark Silver, to join me to talk about the consequences of adopting tech. So, Mark, thank you so much for being on my podcast.
Oh, Gia, thank you very much for inviting me.
Okay, so could you please introduce yourself to our audience?
Certainly, I'm a professor of information technology. I was on the faculty at the Anderson Graduate School of Management at UCLA,
Okay.
and then the Stern School of Business at NYU. And now I am a professor and also the associate dean for undergraduate studies at the Gabelli School at Fordham University.
Nice. So, I'm going to ask you some questions about your personal journey pursuing tech, right?
Okay,
So, what first drew you to tech?
that's a really good question. I can think back to when I was 10 years old,
Okay.
and someone gave me this toy computer. It wasn't electronic, but it was plastic and metal, but you really could program it. And I didn't know it then, but it really was based on the same theories that you learn in computer science. And I don't know if they gave it to me because I was already interested, or if I was already, or if I became interested from using it. But ever since then, I just loved computers. Now, when I was in college, I had to make a choice. I didn't go for computer science. I actually became a theoretical math major, but I worked for the university on the side doing computer programming. And
So
the,
applied then, applied
exactly. That's exactly the
science.
word. So then when I graduated, I had to make a choice between theory and applied.
Yes.
And I went with the applied. I worked for a couple of years for a startup in database management systems, a software company. And all the principals were actually Wharton professors. So after about 2 years, I went back to Wharton for a PhD in information technology. But the thing about Wharton in those days is they had just created a new department called Decision Sciences.
Ah.
And they combined information technology and management science operations research, which is kind of the quantitative side of management and decision making, and a little cognitive psychology, behavioral decision theory, and a little microeconomics. And the idea was if you really want to understand how people make decisions, you need to look at all of those things.
Yes.
So technically, I'm a decision scientist, but a decision scientist who specializes in information technology. And I was really in the right place at the right time because right at that point in time, where the business world was starting to use information technology to help support rather than replace decision makers. And that's exactly what decision scientists are interested in. So there's this play by Moliere where the character is so excited to learn he was speaking prose all his life. He always wanted to speak prose. So it was the same thing. I discovered that what I was doing when I was programming for the university actually had a name. I was doing decision support systems, and now I understood the theory to go with it. And that's what I've been doing ever since.
Nice. So you got inspired by your professors, and then maybe because of that, you are motivated to become a professor yourself, right? And also we talk about decision support, and now there are like so many different versions of description about it, right? So business intelligence, business analytics, data science, data analytics, right?
Yes, I think, well, I don't want to say I wasn't motivated by my professors, but I think I just loved the universities. I like being on the campus. And so it was just, I wanted to spend my life in the universities, and I like doing research and teaching. So that's sort of how I became a professor. But for many of those years, I really was specializing, as you said, in decision support. But analytics in many ways is newfangled decision support.
Yes.
But what I really became more interested in was not the technology, but really in how people use the technology, which is the behavioral side. So that's really what information systems is. It's the combination of technology and behavior.
Nice. Since you're talking about the behavioral side, right?
Right.
Let's talk about the digital transformation, right? Of so many different things. Could be business, could be society, could be individual use of technology. We know that technology has been transforming society for years. And now the very hot word is AI, right?
Yes.
So seeing examples such as, for example, the internet, right? Personal computers, and then user generated content, social media, virtual reality, augmented reality, AI, Gen AI, and recently AI persona and AI agents. Could you please give me some examples about the digital transformation?
Certainly. So I kind of think of it as four phases. And the interesting question is, by the way, whether there'll be a fifth phase or whether we're going to be in this fourth phase forever. But it started out in the 1950s and 1960s. I won't give you too much history, but in the 1950s and 1960s, with really automating, they were called transaction processing systems, where basically companies saved money by replacing people with machines to do their accounting and that kind of thing. But what would happen was, because they were doing this, they were accumulating mountains of data, and they just sat there. And so people said, why don't we reprocess this data, give it to managers so they can manage better? And that's where we got management information systems and what I was referring to as decision support systems. And that was like the 70s and the 80s. They were still doing the other stuff, but now they're doing something else. In the 90s, late 80s, 90s, businesses here and there started figuring out that they could use technology strategically. So if you think about airlines like American and United that had the best reservation systems, they did all sorts of things to get strategic advantage from them. And a lot of
Because of
airlines,
the data in it, right?
because of the data and also because of the way they manipulated the functions, the applications, and because of the way they related to their competitors also, because they had the best systems, their competitors had to use their systems. So if you think about it, a lot of the competitors are out of business. American and United are still here. There's a company called American Hospital Supply. They've been bought by somebody, so they don't exist anymore. This is going to sound like so simple to you, but in 1980, this was a big deal. They put a terminal in a hospital so hospitals could order supplies electronically. And because hospitals order hundreds of thousands, think about all the sizes of Band-Aids, of supplies, and they can't run out because you can't tell a patient, we don't have any oxygen today. So being able to order electronically gave the hospital so many benefits that American Hospital Supply got a 50% market share. One more example, which would be, let's choose Otis Elevator. So Otis Elevator was already the leading elevator company, but they put microchips, they put microprocessors in their elevators to create what we take for granted now as smart elevators. But because they own so much of the market, by creating smart elevators, they weren't only selling elevators, they were the only ones who could service their elevators. And they again gained competitive advantage. So to summarize, the strategic phase is that businesses found ways to get competitive advantage over their rivals. Now, you asked me about transformations and digital transformations. All of those are transformations, but what's really transformative is the phase we're in now and the technologies that you mentioned. And so, classic examples, Amazon just transformed the way people buy things. And Netflix and others transformed the way we're entertained, from physical media to streaming media. There's a company called Fresh Direct that transformed supermarkets, that instead of having lots of physical supermarkets, they just have one giant warehouse and they deliver to the customer from that warehouse. They get all sorts of economies of scale. The customers get all sorts of convenience, and it's a win-win, and they've transformed that industry. And of course, social media, we know social media has radically transformed society,
Yeah.
and everybody says AI is going to. I think we all know that's true. We just don't know how.
Exactly.
And that's a little frightening, but that's another topic for another time.
Yeah. So all the examples that you gave, right? They are transforming the societies in a very massive way, right?
Yes.
So these are the technologies that are staying, right, to transform the societies. And over the many years, we've seen some technology that didn't get right to stay, right? So like I sometimes tell my students, right? So tech is very much like fashion. Some trends come, some trends go, and some trends choose to stay and become the norm, right? So the example that I gave about social media, everybody's using social media right now, and we are not so excited about it because that's the norm, right? So in this whole process, long process of many waves of technological advancement, and then in your opinion, what is the role of the users?
So the role of the users, well, let me tell you someone else's opinion first. You often hear people talk about the impact of technology on people, businesses, society, and kind of the image is that there's a highway and a person or business or all of us are standing in the highway and a truck is coming down the highway 100 miles per hour and it slams into us. And
Very
what a,
passive. So,
exactly. Whatever happens to us
Mhm.
is the impact of technology. But that kind of implies that we don't matter.
Mhm.
And it's really what you might call a kind of a focus on the technology as doing things.
Mm.
But that's just not true. We play a role in how we adopt and, as you said, how we use technology.
Mhm.
And so that, I think, is a better way to think about it. Is not the impact metaphor, but it's really that there is an interaction between people and systems, and it's that interaction that leads to good things
It's the
or bad
behavioral
things.
aspect that
It's the
comes.
exactly it's the behavioral aspect. Here's just a simple example that I love.
Mhm.
And by the way, that last metaphor I gave you was from a professor, a late professor named Rob Kling. So I want to give credit where credit is due. I can't remember the name of the person who wrote this dissertation, but it's a great dissertation. Maybe 20 years ago, he was studying an ER, an emergency room in a hospital in Boston. And it turned out that almost all of the patients were from, if you want to guess, you'll never guess. This
No,
is
really. You tell me.
Afghanistan.
Really.
Now, why were all the patients from Afghanistan? Well, someone was analyzing the data and said, I've got to figure this out. Well, it turns out that if you take all the countries and list them alphabetically, Afghanistan is the first one.
Oh.
And they made the interface alphabetical order. And so this is an ER. The nurses, the technicians, the doctors, they trying to save somebody's life. They don't care where they came from. They just pick the first thing on the list all the time. So
Oh,
you
okay.
got bad data in the system. That's how,
Human error.
you know, and that's human error, but that's not an exception. The very high percentage of the data in our systems is wrong because of human error. But I'm going to say it a little differently. It's not just human error, because the human made the mistake because the system was alphabetical. But it's not the system's fault because the people could have picked the right thing. It's that interaction between the two. And that's, in so many cases, what really matters. I'm going to add, it's in so many cases what people don't think about, because they think about one or the other. The technology made me do it, the computer made me do it, or I'm sovereign, I do whatever I want with my technology.
Mhm. So can I understand it like as a technology provider, as you are
Sure.
developing the technology itself, it could be, any versions of the software. You also need to really put yourself in the shoes of the users and consider that context, consider this user experience, and then, revisit your design.
That's exactly right. And I think most of the major companies have finally figured that out. But even so, very often it just doesn't happen.
Mm. Okay, so let's revisit,
Okay.
right, the educational aspect of our conversation in terms of your teaching style, right? Because you
So,
mentioned that you love the campus environment and you want to be a professor from many years ago. So, what is the most important thing that you teach to your students about tech?
so the very first class, I ask them a question and I say, what do you think is going to be the most important thing in this course?
Mm.
But tell me in a single word.
Ah.
And so they used to say computers. And computers are there, but that's not the most important thing. And today, it's not even computers, right? It's an iPhone, it's whatever. So then sometimes they say information. And I like that a lot better because information isn't about the technology. It's about what you do with the technology.
Applied.
Exactly. You create information, you process information, you use information, but it's still not the answer I want. And when I tell them the answer, it really surprises them. The answer is consequences.
Oh, okay.
And I would go a step further and I would say consequences is one of the most important concepts in life. Think about what parents tell their children. If you don't behave, there will be
Consequences.
Exactly. And this child thinks that consequences means the same thing as punishment, but it doesn't. They're two different things. If you tell a
Could be
child,
positive consequences.
that's true.
If you keep eating vegetables, you'll get a reward.
That's exactly right. In fact, that's really important that there are positive and negative consequences. And punishments also aren't the same even as negative consequences. Because if you tell a child, if you run with that ice cream cone, you're going to drop it. and they drop it and just splat. You didn't punish them. It was a natural consequence. And so this is why, so where did the consequence come from? It came from the child's behavior, their actions. And so that's really the most important thing for my students to know, that actions matter, that actions lead to consequences, and consequences are all what it's all about. Let me give you, if you like, an
Yeah,
example,
yes.
one
I
or
love
two
to
of
hear
that.
concrete examples.
So I'm going to go back to the Afghanis in the emergency room, or the not people who aren't really Afghanis in the emergency room. So you might say, well, that's a silly example. So you get bad data. But what's really hot today? Business analytics, data analytics, and AI. And what do they drive off of? Data. So if your data are bad, then your analyses are bad.
Of course.
The recommendations you get are bad.
Garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah, exactly. The decisions you make are bad, and you or your business or society are in huge trouble. So AI and analytics only work if you have good data. And the consequences are what you do with the data, but it still matters about the data because of the consequences. But if you don't think about the consequences, you won't know to create the good data.
Yes, that's very true. It feels like there are two dimensions based upon what you said. One is on the individual level, and then turns out that many individual users, including myself, right,
Sure.
we are at the very vulnerable side. We are very much like a passive, watching the trend coming. We don't have much say in it unless we advocate for our users' rights very much through social media movements, etc., to let our
Yes.
voices out, or give feedback to the software vendors, or just push the managerial people to say, hey, this system doesn't work. We have to get a new one.
Right.
So this is one part. And then the other dimension is from the societal level. So what are the consequences of using tech to affect the society? I'm sure there are like positive sides and also the negative sides. You said something about in the very beginning, right, when certain technologies are being introduced to the workplace, and then there could be impact on the labor market, right? So generally speaking, we don't need to talk about labor market per se, but generally speaking, what is the consequences of using tech to society?
Sure. Let me give you first an indirect answer, kind of a lead up, and then I'll give you a direct answer to your question. So we were talking about the interaction between technology and people or businesses. So if you think of the examples I gave you before of just successful strategic use of technology, Amazon, Netflix, Fresh Direct, those people didn't throw technology at the problem. They had a fit between their business and their business model and the technology. And that's really why they succeeded.
The alignment.
The alignment. And there are lots of businesses who don't do that or didn't do that. They just focused on the gee whiz technology and they went out of business. And that was part of what the dot-com bust was. And so it really is the interaction between these forces that leads to consequences.
And also very much like the AI phase that we are in, right? Many companies are somehow proactively or passively adopting AI because their competitors are doing so. This is becoming the industry standard.
Exactly.
Right? A lot of confusion that could be happening.
That's right. And that happens in every era, that some companies are using technology strategically and some are using it out of competitive necessity, but some are somewhere in between. They don't really know why they're using it.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's really get into trouble. But yeah, let's use AI as the example. So we know, or at least we believe, I guess we know, that there is an upside to AI. At least we're promised one that will be more efficient, will be more effective. And what does that mean? We'll be richer, or we'll have more leisure time, or your life will be wonderful. But we also know already that there's a downside to AI. I mean, the first is the same downside we have with so many technologies, that if you don't do it right, you don't get the benefits. There was a study out of, I think, MIT recently that 95% of pilots in businesses with AI have actually failed. So part of it is that. But the other part of it is actually when you succeed in some respects, maybe you're more efficient, maybe you're more effective, but you have all these other negative side effects, maybe for you, maybe for your employees, maybe for society. So think about it. And this is all over the news, that what it's almost like back in the 50s and 60s with transaction processing,
Mm,
that AI systems are replacing people.
yes.
Now, the answers I hear is no, 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 no. AI systems will, in the long run, augment people, and so people are going to lose jobs. That's ridiculous.
It's a matter of time.
People are already
It's a
losing.
matter of time.
People are already losing jobs, and more people are going to lose jobs. So unemployment is an issue. But now let's think about
AI is also creating new jobs, right? So we need to like reskill, right? And also adjust our curriculum, etc., in order to help people to transition.
that's true. So this is now my personal opinion,
Yeah.
and a colleague of mine who probably knows more than I do said, "Don't say this." I'm not sure that he disagreed. He just said, "Don't say this." But throughout history, throughout those last 75 years I was describing to you, people have always feared that new technologies would lead to massive unemployment.
Mm.
And what happened was some people were unemployed, but technological advances always led to economic advances and overall more common good and more employment.
Mm.
I'm not sure that's going to be the case with AI. That's what
Because
that's what he told me not to say.
it's changing too fast, and then the speed for people to reskill, right, is not matching the speed of
That's a big part of it.
developing AI.
And because it's also moving so fast, we don't really know where it's going. But what people used to say with those systems that just replaced clerks with transaction processing is, well, knowledge workers aren't going to be replaced, and people who do physical jobs aren't going to be replaced. It's just people who are pushing paper. But
Yes.
now knowledge workers are being replaced, accountants, lawyers, and we have robots that are replacing physical workers. The robot could clean the bathroom for you. So I really
Exactly.
do start
It's
to
about
worry about
cost
unemployment.
control in order to mass produce this, right?
Exactly. So I really do worry about, not to scare everyone, but I
Yeah.
worry about the societal effects, but it gets even worse.
Mm.
And again, they're all upsides, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
But the theme, if there's any less message I want to send to you and your listeners, is that if you don't worry about the downsides, they're going to get you. If you worry about them, then maybe you can find a way to avoid them or make things better. As you were saying, purposefully reskilling.
Yeah.
So here's how it gets worse.
Mm.
Is what about the people who don't lose their jobs? The people who really are still experts that are needed for their human expertise and their experience. Well, how do they get expertise and experience if they are being computer augmented? If they are relying on the computers, if they're relying on AI? What I think is ridiculous, it's just my opinion, is people say you can't trust what comes out of ChatGPT. So you got to check
For
it.
now,
Yes,
right?
yeah, but I want to take it slightly different for now. And you're right, every week or every month, the hallucinations get better.
Yeah.
But they say you've got to check it. But for now,
Mm.
so if it's a factual thing, you can check it and say, wow, that doesn't exist, even though it told me it does. The story isn't there. But what about when it makes recommendations? It's giving you advice. It's suggesting how to make decisions. There's no right or wrong up front. You have no way of checking whether it's right or wrong. All you can do is ask an expert. But if you are supposed to be the expert, you've got nobody to ask. So I think a second real concern is going to be de-skilling of the whole workforce, even people who are employed. And that's not a good thing. Then we have, and actually your research touches on this a lot, which is biases.
Yeah.
That biases that come out of AI systems in a variety of ways are known. And this is bad. Here we go again. It's bad for at least two reasons. One is if you're relying on the information to make decisions, biased outputs lead to biased decisions, which are usually bad decisions.
Exactly. And then since like these AI algorithms can be used to make decisions, right? So it's
Yes.
autonomous and everything. So, and then if the trust is not there per se, right?
Right.
And then people, okay, let me rephrase it. So if people trust it too much, the decision makers, without knowing there could be biases and everything, and there will be consequences, as you
Yes.
said, right? So some people could not get a job because of certain hints that are reflected in the
Yes.
resume that are not the good candidate, like material, so that their qualification is never in evaluated before making a decision, right? So yes, so we definitely will need more attention towards these
Mm.
AI biases for sure.
That's true. So what you're really saying is there are two effects of the biases. One is just bad decision making,
Mhm.
but the other is discrimination.
Yeah.
And this is part of really what your research focuses on,
Mhm.
as I understand it.
Yeah.
That people will be discriminated against by those biases.
Mhm.
That it will advantage some people and disadvantage others.
Mhm.
That's also true today of social media.
Yeah.
But AI just makes that all worse.
Mhm.
So
Because it is a black box, right, to many people.
exactly. But as you're talking about trust and replacing people, here's the conundrum. This is the classic question. You're part of a regulatory agency, let's say.
Mm.
You're responsible for a nuclear power plant.
Mm.
What do you want to have happen when the alarm bells are going off? Do you want the AI to figure out whether it should shut down the system automatically, or do you want a human being to do it? Now, the AI didn't get a bad night's sleep. It wasn't stuck in traffic. It didn't have a fight with its significant other. It's going to be much more consistent. So you might say, hey, slam dunk, let the AI do it. But then think about what we were saying a little while back, that the AI doesn't have any experience with this decision.
Yeah.
It doesn't have the human factors to take into account of, well, this is a high consequence event. If, heaven forbid, radiation spreads, maybe you really do need a human being with human sensibilities and sensitivities making the decision.
Yeah.
And it's a concern, and I agree with you completely. Over time, the balance is going to shift, but it can't shift all the way. And so it's a problem. So, yeah, it's another issue are those biases and bad decision making. But there are other things too. For example, all of this is driven by data, just like, and this is
Very
true of
true.
social media also. It raises lots of privacy issues.
Yeah, yes.
Uh,
Copyright issue too.
Oh, that's right. Actually, you're right. Two completely separate issues with that way. There's intellectual property and private intellectual property issues in terms of copyright, and then there's just privacy. And so these are again negative consequences. How could we deal with them? Well, companies could self-regulate. Government could regulate, which they may well do, or they've done in some cases more in Europe than in the United States.
Yeah, exactly.
Individuals can do what they can try to do, or businesses to protect their privacy by not letting some of their data out and using internal systems. But it's ultimately a real challenge. And so it's again one more potential downside, which doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. But again, the message is if you don't think about the downsides, they are definitely going to get you. So the answer is to plan for them and try to minimize those downsides.
Okay, it sounds like for the societal level consequences, and then they could be even more massive because it's affecting every single person. In order to address that, for the individual level effort is not enough. So we need a collaborative effort from a few stakeholders, the regulators for sure, and different tech companies for sure, all together, and also individual users or advocating for our
Yes.
rights. And then at the same time, to take preventative measures in order to, protect our data, for example, data privacy, etc., and then to use the technology properly.
That's just for a second there, you gave me what would either be a great idea or a terrible idea,
Oh, yes,
which
please.
would be to crowdsource the solution to these problems. But I'm not sure that's sort of like using technology for technology. I'm not sure that would actually have a good outcome, but that's really an interesting thought. But yeah, the question you're really asking about, how do we do these protections is I think is an open question that but again, there are lots of people who aren't asking the question, and they're the ones who are really going to get most burned by these privacy issues. And so that's why again I use the word consequences a lot, but you have to think about not just what you're doing and whether you're enjoying doing it, and not just all the positive consequences you're aiming for, which you may fail to get. But you really do have to think about what could be problematic. Let's go back to those airlines with reservation systems.
Yeah, please.
It turns out some of the things they did to get competitive advantage were actually illegal. Well, and some of the others were probably unethical. So again, just because you can get benefits doesn't, and ultimately the government stepped in to prevent that. So there's a history of government playing a role in using policy to protect individuals and businesses.
So you touched upon two important points here. One, we can continue to talk about the different categories of consequences,
Right.
right? And then the second one is what should we do about it? You talk about like users, right? Preventative measures to protect the data and everything. So let's first continue to talk about the categories of the consequences. So far, we have mentioned individual level and societal level, more about the misuse of the system in a
Right.
way. But do you think that we are relying on technology a little bit too much so that we are losing the ability to think on our own? For example, the use of GPS, right? Do
So
you want to
sure.
go?
I was sure. I was going to say and AI also,
Yes, AI as well.
and it depends a lot on the individual.
Mm.
There's some of us are and some of us aren't. But you're right. GPS and Waze is a great example.
Mm.
And let me give you two different Waze or GPS examples.
Yeah, please.
The first is just the plain old reliance. Well, let's ask a different question,
Yeah.
which is why do we use them at all? We use them to get where we're going as efficiently as possible. But what we do? So Waze tells us leave at 10:30. So we leave at 10:30. Maybe if we're cautious, we leave at 10:25. Now, if we didn't have Waze, if we had somebody's directions or a map, we'd probably leave at 10 o'clock because we know we're going to make a wrong turn somewhere. So we rely on Waze, and then there's a traffic jam that Waze didn't spot in time. It's not Waze's fault. It just isn't capable of spotting it in time. Or our phone dies because the battery runs out. And now here you are.
It happens to me a lot.
Exactly. I was thinking that. Here you are 2 miles from your destination and you have no idea how to get there.
Exactly.
So sometimes we fail to accomplish our objectives because we're so reliant on technology, we don't do smart things to protect ourselves. But the even more extreme case is where we just kind of blindly use the technology and dumb ourselves down.
Over-trusting.
Overtrust and dumb down. And so the example here is there was an episode of The Office where they're driving.
I remember
and they drive into a lake because they're just following the GPS. Now it's funny. Yeah, you're right. It is funny.
It's funny.
And you might say it's funny and it's a sitcom, and these things don't happen in real life, but they do happen in real life. In fact, and this was hard for me to believe, but
maybe not to the lake per se because that's too obvious, but dead end for sure.
Dead ends, but this is not the lake. How about the ocean? I checked this out because I didn't believe it when I read it at first. There was a couple in Australia. They were tourists. They drove into the Pacific Ocean because the GPS told them to. So if you ask me, do people get dumbed down by technology?
I
Sure.
wonder what the conversation could be in the car when they are seeing the ocean and they're doubting the use of technology then.
Exactly. But think about it though. Our cars have all sorts of safety features built in. I'm not sure it's going to protect against that drowning, although there are devices you can use to smash the windows too. But that's really part of the answer to the question you've been asking all through is what can we do? We can be proactive, and we're not. And maybe that's an unfair generalization, but I don't think we are. I think we all know what I've been saying, which is technology can burn you. And because we know it because we've been burned, and we've been burned more than once. But like a week later, we forget that we were burned, and we again drive into the Pacific Ocean, as it were. we don't pay attention to the consequences, and we let it happen. And so that's why you really have to proactively think about two things: what might prevent me from succeeding, and even if I succeed, what might go wrong. So let's put it back in a business context. So lots of businesses use systems to try to increase sales. Lots of businesses use systems to try to decrease costs. And sometimes they succeed and sometimes they just don't because they didn't understand well enough their market or their customers. So it's not, the way I would say it is the benefits aren't automatic. You have to work for them. You have to make sure you understand how you're going to increase sales with this CRM system. Similarly, let's say you're trying to decrease costs. Well, what if you succeed in decreasing costs, but you really degraded the quality of your product or the quality of your customer service? So now you've got a win here and a loss here, and how do you balance them out? For some businesses, it's a net gain. For some, it's a net loss. So the important thing is, it's kind of like medication. That we take medication because we need it or because it hopefully will do good things for us. But every medication has a
Side
warning
effect.
label on the bottle. Yeah, exactly. It says it may cause all these side effects. And you and your medical professional have to decide, is it worth the risk of the side effects to get the potential benefits? But notice how I said it. The risk of the side effects and the potential benefits.
It's not guaranteed.
Neither one is guaranteed because we live in an uncertain world. And now we get a little more certainty when we do government policies and so forth, as you said,
Yeah.
although that raises its own concerns.
Yeah. I really like the metaphor that I gave about the medication. So about the potential gains and also the side effects.
Oh,
So we hope.
I was going to give you just another example from
Yeah.
our industry,
Yes, please.
which is education and just digital notes. So there are a lot of professors who will now give the students their notes in advance, or they'll tell the students you will get a recording after class. And the theory is that you're making life easier for the student. They can pay better attention in class because you're giving them the notes. They don't have, or they're going to get better notes because you're giving them the notes. But what studies show is that attendance in these classes drops significantly. And so, a lot of professors won't give out the notes. And so it's, again, there's an upside and a downside. But you know what may determine whether attendance drops significantly is how interesting the professor is. If you're one of these swing from the chandeliers, great professors, they'll still come to your class, even if you give out the notes. If you are putting people to sleep, they'll sleep at home. So it's, again, the interaction. It's not the technology. It's not the professor. It's some combination of the professor, the students, and the technology that either lead to better education or worse education.
So I like the two examples that I gave. One about the medication that is more certain than the educational setting. So in the more certain scenario, you are presented with the potential gains and also the possible side effects. So kind of know what could happen in terms of the consequences.
Right.
And then you can make a more cautious decision as a user if you pay attention to this
Right.
type of information. The second one is more uncertain, out of good intention though, right? Sharing the notes and everything. So from the educator's point of view or from the student's point of view, there are more uncertainty there. So they don't know how to react to this until that happens, right? So it's kind of like a learning curve, right? So how do users foresee these consequences, possible consequences, so that they can take certain, actions or decisions in terms of adopting this technology in certain ways?
Sure, I think that's true, and I think that harkens back to a distinction you made before that was really important between individual users and business users. So let's talk first about the way you framed it for individual users. It's actually a hard question, but that's part of what technology education needs to be about. When people
Good point.
self-learn tools,
Yeah.
I mean, everybody knows how to post a pic because they learned that, but they don't know when not to post a picture. That it can come back to haunt them. And so ultimately, you can't know in advance all the possibilities and know what decision to make. But I really think we can educate people or educate ourselves if we have the materials to understanding the connection between what we do and the technology and what is going to happen. And by doing that, we'll be in a position to do that. And again, people don't always learn. A week later, we fall back to the bad habits. So it's really, again, I think the role of educational systems to train people. There is another answer, which is AI.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of uncertainty. So we are learning as well as educators.
Right. So, but AI, while it's potential upside and potential downside, it may also be the tool to warn people that when they're using some other tool, maybe AI warns you not to rely so much on Waze. And so that would be an interesting outcome for individuals. But for businesses should know better. Businesses do risk analysis on large projects.
Yeah.
And
Have their
even
own
s-
divisions.
So in theory, they should be able to do it. But there too, they may not be insightful enough about the possible set of negative consequences. It's almost as though you have to do a brainstorming exercise to ask yourself what could go wrong and then what are the probabilities. But the probabilities don't matter until you first figure out what could go wrong. Um, for me, this is an oldie but goodie. This goes back a lot of years.
Yeah.
But Bank of America was at one time the technological leader among banks worldwide. They invented the magnetic ink that's on everybody's checks. They invented all sorts of other things. But then they were putting in place a new system to manage their trust division. And I think I may get the numbers wrong, but I think it was a $20 million project that came in several years late for $80 million. But and it never really worked right. But that's not the worst of it. It was managing their trust division. They didn't have a system that worked. And so all of their trust clients went to somebody who had a system that did work. They lost billions of dollars.
Wow.
And the mistake, well, there are all sorts of things that can go wrong,
Yeah.
But the mistake was at the beginning, they didn't ask themselves what could go wrong and protect themselves against it. So maybe we took too much risk. The scale was too big. We were just trying to fix something, and instead we tried to reinvent it, and we invented it poorly. So businesses fall into that trap also, but one would hope they would be less likely.
Mm. You touched upon the answer to my next question,
Oh, okay.
right? Which will be, what are the action implications for individuals or societies considering the consequences?
Great question. It's on the one hand, it's the most important question, and yet I always feel uncomfortable trying to answer it because I'm afraid my answer isn't good enough, or it seems obvious or intuitive. But the real reason the consequences matter, the reason that it matters to parents and children, the reason it matters to businesses using technology, is because our actions have consequences. And you asked me about what's actionable. And so the answer is you need to act wisely. And it's not clear if you could teach somebody to act wisely. It's not clear if you could tell yourself, act wisely. The first step, though, is to tell yourself to act wisely. The second step is to be proactive. And so what's really is actionable is kind of the things, as you said, I hinted at earlier, is asking yourself, what could get in the way of my things going right and what could go wrong? And the way I like to describe it to my students is you have 3 goals with technology, and this is all about acting wisely. You want to leverage the benefits. You want to just maximize the benefits. You want to avoid the pitfalls. So avoid the things that are going to be disasters. And then you want to overcome the obstacles that may make the technology less useful than it would have been, or may give you that balance between some good and some bad. So it's really being conscious of benefits, pitfalls, and obstacles. And again, we could teach some of that, but a lot of it is just proactivity. And if I figure out a better answer to that, I'll be happy to come back on your podcast and give you another answer. But I've been thinking about this for a long time. And I think awareness, just like with a lot of things, is really important.
I totally agree with you, especially right now. There could be a lot of confusion in terms of the use of AI. Everybody knows that we have to use AI because it's becoming the work norm, how you work, right? But how to use AI wisely, right? That's a big question. So, kind of summarize our conversation, in the metaphor, which is, it seems like technology itself is a double-edged sword. So it has the bright side and also the concerning side.
Yes.
So in order to fully embrace the bright side, we need to keep innovating about technology, right, to embrace the bright side. But for the concerning side, we do need, first of all, individuals' efforts about being aware of this, or taking the next step, which is to advocating for our user rights, and also technology companies' efforts in terms of making responsible decisions. And then the last one will be the educators as well as the regulators' efforts in order to make people be aware of this, right? And then also to address any of these tech risks,
Exactly.
right?
Very well said.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Mark, for coming to my podcast. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you, Gia. Thank you for having me. This was fun.
Yeah, it is. Thank you.